Hi, I'm Don Dergler, editor of Claims Journal. Thank you for joining us for Claims Journal's podcast. This regular video series on all things claims related is just one of several ongoing changes here at Claims Journal. We've launched a website redesign, beefed up our coverage of how AI and technology are transforming claims departments around the world, and we're now bringing you a steady stream of expert-written insight on trends and best practices in written and video formats. Stay tuned, there's more to come. Hi, I'm here with Caitlin Ewing with Allianz. Thanks for being here, Caitlin.
Thanks for having me, Don.
So before we get started, tell me about what you do with Allianz.
I am a complex claims analyst at Allianz. I handle cyber, media, and tech E&O claims for our North American large corporate insureds. In addition, I help on similar claims for our global insureds who are based overseas, but then have local policies written out of North America.
Well, we're heading into Black Friday, my favorite time of the year, and the kickstart of shopping season is next month. And that brings a lot of attention to cyber, as well as recent events probably bringing even more attention to cyber. What can we expect, and what are you telling your clients to prepare for into late November and early December, I guess?
When you look at North America and you think of this time of year, Black Friday, you automatically think of the retail sector. It's the busiest time of year for the sector, and they have already been the target as a sector of some high profile events earlier this year. Obviously, in our recent report, we talk about some of those ones like Marks and Spencer that were all over the news earlier in the year, hit hard on that sector in particular. And it's sort of one of the key industries that we see as a target. It's one of the top three in terms of values and volumes. And it makes sense. And I think that we'll continue to see it through the end of the year, given the sort of three key overarching elements of that sector, which are high volume of customer data, high volume of financial transactions and sales, and then their sort of broad attack area. If you think about I call them like a 3S situation where you have significant numbers of staff, significant numbers of systems, and significant number of suppliers. So it just makes them more prone to attacks because of this broad attack area.
Well, what big or more frequent cyber claims will we see emerge from this time of year?
Well, I think you'll see a continuation of the sort of supply chain attacks that we've seen a growth of between this year and last year. Last year, I think about 6% of claim values were driven by contingent business interruption losses, whereas this year it's up to the first half of this year, it's already up to 15%. That's obviously a huge increase year over year. Yeah. And it goes to that sort of, I guess, two ways of thinking about supply chains. I think if you're talking to a person on the street, supply chain, you might think of, widget being delivered to a factory. But for most companies these days, supply chain includes their IT infrastructure because there are a lot of vendors involved in providing those services. So I think that will continue to be a driver of claims and losses.
Well, Allianz recently came out with a report, which you kind of mentioned in the beginning, that addressed things like cyber and ransomware. Can you talk about a few things that stick out in that report?
I did kind of touch a little bit upon the supply chain issue. I think that's going to be an ongoing sort of driver of losses we see. I think the three key sectors that we see a lot of the losses being driven by will continue to be dominant, manufacturing, retail, and professional services. Those are really take up a lot of the oxygen when we talk about claims. So those are going to be big drivers. I think the supply chain issue can be the attacks on the supply chain, but also we've seen some technical failures more recently and then within the last year. So it can be ransomware, but it can also be technical failures driving those sort of supply chain impacts for the insured.
Well, let's get into the numbers and the data. What are the big claims? I mean, where are they coming from? What industries? What sizes of business? I know Allianz has a lot of big businesses, but any sort of data and stats you can shed some light on things.
Sure. Year over year, I think we're seeing sort of consistent claim volume. The about 50% of our claim severity has sort of dropped in severity. I think 60% of our large cyber claims are driven by ransomware, but there are some other areas of claims that continue to grow. So we see, as I mentioned, I handle tech, claims. That's sort of a growing area in terms of claim value. That's gone up to about 25% so far this year. Historically, we have seen significant value in terms of data collection events. So not just a ransomware event where an insured suffers an attack and then there's data exfiltration that's then posted on the dark web, for example. We see a lot of claims deriving from data privacy regulations across states that I think we haven't seen a lot of value in those this year, but I don't think those are going anywhere. One thing that I want to mention too is sort of touching on the retail piece again. I mentioned that one of the reasons it's a compelling target is the high number of staff, right? And I think one thing that's worth keeping in mind is AI and sort of the effect that it's having on obviously many things, but it's sort of improving the phishing and the social engineering that we're seeing deployed by the threat actors. So over 60% of the ransomware events last year were driven by some human element. And so the phishing emails that you got, even versus 5 years ago, I think it would be easy to agree that those have improved. And so we see more use of AI in improving those phishing emails, deep fakes, and those types of attack vectors. So that's, I think, going to continue to be sort of a growing area, unfortunately. On the other side, at least, I think there's some benefit of the AI to the insureds in terms of improving their security infrastructure.
But I know you mentioned regulations in California where I'm at. I know there are some pretty stiff regulations if for each piece of data that a company loses, there's thousands, over $1,000, right? That you're going to have to pay for that. So you see that as a potential rise maybe in severity for some companies, right?
Yeah, I think we haven't seen as much on the privacy piece this year. I as I said, I don't think that's going anywhere. I think there's been, year over year, the cybersecurity infrastructure, the hygiene of companies improves. And I think that a lot of the big companies, we've seen the benefit of sort of the partnership between insureds and the insurance industry in terms of improving that hygiene. And that's where we see sort of year over year a decrease in the severity of events to our large insureds. But I think that that's driving a shift towards the smaller and mid-size enterprises. And I think that that's where you'll see some of the shift in, potentially anyway, in the privacy litigation, is that the plaintiff's bar tends to be very entrepreneurial. Yeah. And so I think they may see that sector or those sectors as a little bit more of an opportunity. And honestly, we don't have federal legislation on a lot of the privacy that you have, like in Europe with GDPR. Right. And so we have state by state, and those are going to continue to evolve. And I think that that's always going to kind of perpetuate additional privacy actions.
Right. Yeah, you heard a lot of nightmare scenarios, especially, I said, in California, there's some pretty big.
There's a lot of regulation, yeah.
Yeah, and you're going to get hit pretty hard for that data. Well, can you give me an anecdote about a big loss?
Well, I think it's hard to get into specifics for confidentiality of our insureds, obviously, but I think, two big things that I want to hit on are, I've mentioned the tech, losses that we see. I've had some of those with some of our primary matters that I see, because we handle a lot of we handle a lot of excess and then some primary claims. On the primary side, I've seen some tech, losses that have had some significant value. And I think it's worth keeping those in mind, because the ones I've seen anyway, they tend to be between some sophisticated parties, right? You have two big companies on either side of a claim, and there's a lot of value in terms of the contracts between those parties and whatever's the issue and controversy. So there's value just inherent in the claim itself. And then you have significant legal spend on those claims. And so overall, those can end up with a long tail, because those parties obviously feel like those long-term contracts and the items of value that are tied up in those contracts are really worth fighting over. And then you're going to have a significant legal spend. And I've seen that. I had one that, recently went through many months of resolution processing after a mediation. And it just ends up with that huge cost, and then the long tail that is worth keeping in mind. I think on the other side, one of the big things that I have seen and is common in this space with claims are the business interruption losses. So we have, as I mentioned, there's some of the contingent business interruption losses. You have more of the direct business interruption losses when the insured is the victim of a ransomware event. But on the contingent side, I would say I can think of, events within the last year or so where, you end up with sometimes a tale of two insureds or multiple insureds with very different experiences. So the circumstances that I'm talking about, I had one insured that the technical provider that was impacted by a ransomware event, that technical provider was the backbone of that insured's operations. Whereas another one, it was just part of the puzzle of their entire infrastructure. And so for that one, it ended up being not a claim of significant value, really not much above their retention. Whereas for another one, because of that reliance on that IT infrastructure, it caused a huge impact to their operations for several weeks. And that can be obviously very stressful for the insured, for their employees, for their leadership. And then in terms of the claim itself, digging in and figuring out exactly how a very complicated company was impacted across their systems and their financials takes a lot of time and effort. And so there's a lot of stakeholders involved in resolving those issues. And it can be tens of millions of dollars. And that was the case there. So one where it didn't impact them very much, and another where it was tens of millions of dollars. But thankfully, the insurance coverage was there. The broker did a great job of keeping everyone sort of on the same page, moving it forward. We had a regular cadence of communications with all the stakeholders, and that led to a pretty efficient resolution.
Let's give an overview, if you can, of trends in cyber going forward. Where are we headed in this space for the rest of the year, maybe into next year?
Yeah, I think we'll continue to see the involvement of AI in terms of supporting insureds with their cybersecurity. We'll continue to see the impacts of threat actors relying on AI in terms of improving those attacks through deep fakes and social engineering and business email compromise phishing events. I think the supply chain issue is going to continue to provide a lot of activity, just as we talked about at the top of the show, with retail being a big target this year. All that cloud and IT infrastructure that a lot of companies rely on these days, there's been, I think, what was it? I saw in our report, I think it was like 136% increase in the first half of this year versus prior years on cloud intrusions. And I think that's going to continue apace, because obviously we're seeing all these big data centers being built across the country that's supporting that cloud infrastructure. And so I think it's going to be a big driver of those events, and I always remind our partners internally, don't snooze on the media and the tech, because they can be a big driver of some of the value of these claims.
Well, that's been great. I really appreciate you coming here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Don. I appreciate it.